Hi, I'm Jennifer Sir from the Sewing Room. Over the next few weeks, I will show you how to do different kinds of seams. And seams are really important because they're the foundation of what makes up your garment. We want to make sure our seams are stable and that they're pretty. So sometimes having them look as nice on the inside as it does on the outside makes a huge difference in the way you feel about your garment. So let's get started and sew some seams. Let's learn how to sew a plain seam with 3 different finishes. We'll learn how to sew it with a pinked edge, how to sew it with a zigzagged edge, and how to sew it with a serged edge. We're going to do 3 types of plain seams. Plain seams are just when 2 pieces of fabric are sewn right sides together and then pressed open in the end. So the first one we're going to do is a plain seam with a pinked edge. The second one we'll do is a plain seam with a zigzagged edge. And the third one is a plain seam with a serged edge. And the differences between the 3 are that the more thread on the edges of the seam, the more stable it's going to be. So without further ado, let me show you how to do a plain seam with a pinked edge. I like to sew my seam together first, right sides together. So I like to pin mine too, so I'll pin mine. I like to sew my seams first and then pink it afterwards because that way I know my seam allowance is correct. If I pink my edges first, then my seam allowances could be a little off because the pinking sometimes it's just a little difficult to get it really consistent and straight. So I'll do a 1/2 inch seam. I've backstitched at the beginning and the end. As you can see, here's my seam. I'm using contrast thread so that you can see it better, but normally you would use thread that matches your fabric. After I sew my seam, then I'm going to carefully use my pinking shears and trim as evenly as I can along that edge. And the reason the pinking shears are a good way of finishing is because each of these little triangles that make up the pinked edge, it will cut the fabric on the bias. And when the fabric's on the bias, it doesn't fray as much as when it's just cut on the straight grain. So you can see that it leaves little triangles, little right angles all the way down the edge. And then after we stitch that, then we're going to press it open. And I can press it open with my fingers first here, and then I will give it a quick press with the iron. And you can see our pinked edge 1/2 inch seam allowance pressed open seam, and this is what it looks like on the outside of the garment. So the next version of this would be to do it with a zigzag. So I'll switch my machine to zigzag, and I'm going to zigzag right on the edge of the fabric. I like to zigzag so that my thread goes right off the edge. I may or may not backstitch with the zigzag. It's sort of optional. Now you can see that I have each edge of my 2 pieces finished with a zigzag, and I'm going to put them right sides together. Actually, I believe it's like this. I'll switch the machine back to straight stitch and do a 1/2 inch seam just like I did before. I'll finger press my seam open and then press it open with the iron. And this one is just a little bit more stable than the pinked edge because it has thread binding the edge of the seam allowance. And the third and final version of this is with a serged edge. So I went ahead and pre-serged my edges. So I just used, I used actually a 4 thread, but 3 thread works fine for finishing edges. If you have a serger, this is a great use for it because it really does. You can see it covers way more of the edge of the fabric, and those raw edges are really contained within the serging. So we will put these 2 together, right sides together, and sew them in exactly the same way. When you are serging though, do make sure that you don't cut anything off. You can cut off a few threads if your cutting edge is a little uneven, but with this we want to maintain our entire seam allowance so we don't cut off any of the edge when we're serging. So I'll just back stitch at the beginning and the end just like I did with my other 2. Press open that seam. And you can see also that this looks pretty professional when you do it. So there we have it. We have the plain seam with the serged edge, the plain seam with the zigzag edge, and the plain seam with the pinked edge.